Welcome to A Cup of History, a podcast where we explore key events and figures from world history. I'm Chris, your host, and together with our experts Jesse and Emily, we'll make world history easy to understand and engaging for everyone. Looking for the perfect podcast for your drive? Tune into A Cup of History. We release new episodes 4 times a week on podcasts and twice a week on YouTube. Subscribe now and learn something new while you're on the go. The other day I was thinking about how crazy the 2020 election was. It felt like every day there was something new happening. Do you remember all the chaos that followed?
Oh yes, it was a whirlwind. I still remember the headlines every morning. It wasn't just the election day itself, but everything that came after it. Lawsuits, protests, the whole Stop the Steal movement. It was intense.
Definitely, Chris. It was one of the most unprecedented moments in American history. After Biden won, things didn't settle down like they usually do. Trump and his supporters made several attempts to overturn the results, which really escalated things.
Yeah, that's right. Didn't Trump claim that the election was stolen from him? I think he said there was voter fraud or something along those lines.
Exactly. Trump and his team repeatedly pushed the narrative that the election was rigged, calling it the big lie. They claimed there was widespread fraud, particularly with mail-in ballots, which were used in larger numbers due to the pandemic.
But the thing is, Chris, there was no substantial evidence of that. Investigations by election officials, state and federal courts, and even Trump's own Justice Department found that the election was fair and secure. Even Bill Barr, Trump's attorney general, publicly said that.
So, why did it escalate so much if there was no proof of fraud?
Well, Trump's refusal to concede and the support he got from some key figures created this momentum. His legal team, led by Rudy Giuliani, filed dozens of lawsuits across several states, hoping to challenge the results, but they all got dismissed.
And don't forget the pressure Trump put on local officials. For example, in Georgia, he made that famous call to the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, asking him to find enough votes to overturn Biden's victory there. That was a big deal.
Oh yeah, I remember that. That was shocking to hear. Can a president really do that?
Well, it's not legal, that's for sure. Asking a state official to tamper with votes is a serious violation of election laws. But Trump seemed determined to find a way to stay in power.
Right, and that call was just one example. There were also efforts to push state legislatures in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan to throw out their results and appoint pro-Trump electors instead. But those moves didn't go very far.
So, despite all these attempts, nothing really worked. What about the protests? I remember seeing something about a rally that turned into violence.
Yes, you're probably thinking of January 6, 2021. That was the day when a large group of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol. They were trying to stop Congress from certifying Biden's win.
That was a truly dark day. It was an insurrection, an attempt to overturn the democratic process. People were injured, and several even died. It really showed how deep the divisions had become.
I saw the footage of people breaking into the Capitol. It was unreal. How did things get to that point?
It was a culmination of months of rhetoric and misinformation. Trump had been pushing the narrative that the election was stolen from him, and many of his supporters genuinely believed it. They thought they were defending democracy, ironically.
Exactly. The Stop the Steal movement had been growing, fueled by conspiracy theories and false claims. And on January 6th, it reached its peak when thousands of people marched on the Capitol, encouraged by Trump's words that day.
What did Trump say that day? I didn't catch the whole speech.
He gave a speech at a rally near the White House, where he repeated the false claims of election fraud. He told his supporters to fight like hell to take back their country, and that the election had been stolen. That rhetoric played a big role in inciting the crowd.
And after the Capitol was breached, it took hours for Trump to respond. He eventually put out a video telling his supporters to go home, but even in that message, he repeated the claims that the election was fraudulent.
I guess that's when things really hit the fan. But what happened after that? Did Trump face any consequences for all of this?
Yes, there were significant consequences. Trump was impeached for a second time, making him the first U.S. president to be impeached twice. This time, it was for inciting an insurrection.
The House of Representatives moved quickly on the impeachment. However, like his first impeachment, he was acquitted in the Senate, so he wasn't removed from office. but it still left a lasting mark on his legacy.
And what about all the people who were involved in the Capitol attack? Did they face any punishment?
Yes, hundreds of people have been charged for their roles in the attack. Some have been sentenced to prison for crimes like assaulting police officers, breaking into the Capitol, and disrupting an official proceeding.
Several leaders of far-right groups, like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, were also convicted of seditious conspiracy, which is a serious federal crime.
It's crazy how far things went. So where does that leave Trump now? Is he still pushing the same narrative?
Yes, he's continued to claim that the election was stolen from him, even after all the lawsuits and investigations. And his influence is still strong within the Republican Party.
In fact, some of his allies are still pushing efforts to change election laws in various states, making it harder for some groups to vote. It's part of a broader movement that started after the 2020 election, which many see as a threat to democracy.
So even though Biden is president now, the effects of that election are still being felt.
Absolutely. The aftermath of the 2020 election has had long-lasting impacts, not just on U.S. politics, but also on the public's trust in the electoral process.
Yes, and it's not just about that one election. It has set the stage for how future elections might be contested, and it's raised concerns about the stability of democracy itself.
Wow, it's so much deeper than I realized. It's kind of scary to think about where things could go from here. So, I've been thinking more about the 2020 election aftermath. I know Trump filed a ton of lawsuits, but what was his team actually trying to achieve? Was it just about proving fraud?
Not exactly, Chris. While they kept claiming widespread fraud, the goal was more about delaying the certification of results, creating enough doubt to justify overturning them in the states that Biden won. They wanted to either force recounts or pressure state officials into rejecting the results.
Yeah, Trump's legal team filed over 60 lawsuits across key battleground states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Michigan, but none of them succeeded. They were hoping that if they could win just one case, it would cast doubt on the entire process. But in reality, the courts consistently found no evidence of fraud significant enough to change the outcome.
I remember hearing something about Texas trying to sue other states. That seemed pretty extreme.
You're right. Texas filed a lawsuit against Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin, arguing that those states had violated the Constitution by making last-minute changes to their election procedures. It was one of the more high-profile cases, but the Supreme Court dismissed it pretty quickly.
Exactly. The court said Texas had no standing to challenge how other states conducted their elections. It was a long shot from the beginning, but it did get a lot of attention, especially from Trump's supporters.
So none of these lawsuits worked. Why did they keep trying?
It was mostly about creating enough doubt and confusion to pressure state officials, particularly in Republican-led states, to take action. The hope was that state legislatures would step in and appoint pro-Trump electors, bypassing the actual vote results.
Wow. Did any of those efforts come close to working?
Not really, but there were some close calls. For example, in Michigan, 2 Republican members of the Wayne County Board of Canvassers initially refused to certify the results, but after a lot of public backlash, they reversed their decision.
That sounds intense. What about Georgia? I remember Trump called the Secretary of State there.
Yes, that was a big moment. Trump called Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger on January 2, 2021, and asked him to find 11,780 votes, which was exactly the number he needed to win the state. He pressured Raffensperger to overturn the results, but Raffensperger refused, saying the results were accurate.
That call was later made public and became a key piece of evidence in the investigations into Trump's efforts to overturn the election. It showed how far he was willing to go to try to stay in power.
And that didn't lead to any legal consequences at the time, right?
Not immediately, but it did spark investigations. Trump's efforts in Georgia have been part of ongoing legal cases, including a grand jury investigation into whether he violated state election laws by trying to interfere with the vote count.
It's wild that a sitting president could do that. Were there other states where he tried similar things?
Yes, Pennsylvania and Arizona were also targeted. Trump's team tried to get state lawmakers to step in and appoint their own electors. In Arizona, the strategy focused on promoting baseless claims of voter fraud. They even held hearings with Republican legislators to push their narrative. But none of it worked.
So, even though none of these efforts succeeded, it sounds like they were pretty close in some cases. What stopped them?
A lot of it came down to the integrity of local and state officials. Even in states led by Republicans, most election officials and judges followed the law and refused to cave under pressure. They certified the results and defended the integrity of the election.
Exactly. The courts played a major role too. Time and again, judges dismissed these lawsuits for lack of evidence. Even judges appointed by Trump rejected these cases, which was important in upholding the legitimacy of the election.
It seems like there was a lot of chaos in the courts, but they ultimately upheld the law. Still, it's hard to believe there was so much effort to overturn the election.
It really was a test of the system, Chris. The fact that none of these efforts worked shows that, at least in this case, the rule of law prevailed. But it also revealed vulnerabilities in the system, especially with how much pressure was put on state and local officials.
Yeah, it's important to remember how fragile the situation was. The legal and political battles showed how close things came to a real constitutional crisis. If just a few more people had gone along with Trump's efforts, the outcome could have been very different.
It's crazy to think about how close things came. So what do you think this all means for the future?
Well, it's already having an impact. We're seeing efforts in many states to change election laws, often making it harder to vote or giving more power to state legislatures over election results. These changes are often framed as election integrity measures, but critics argue they could be used to undermine future elections.
And Trump's influence is still strong. He continues to push the false claim that the election was stolen, and that's keeping the idea alive among many of his supporters. This could shape how future elections are contested, especially in tight races.
So, even though this one is over, the fight is far from done, huh?
Exactly. The legal battles may be over for now, but the political and cultural impact is ongoing. It's something that will affect U.S. democracy for years to come.
And it's not just about Trump. The broader movement that grew around him, the distrust in institutions, and the spread of misinformation have created deep divisions in the country. That's the real challenge going forward.
It sounds like the story is far from over. I can't believe how much happened behind the scenes. Thanks for breaking it down for me, guys.
You're welcome, Chris. It's a complex story, but it's important to understand how we got here.
Definitely, and we'll keep digging into it in our next episode.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget, we release new episodes 4 times a week on podcasts and twice a week on YouTube. Subscribe now and keep learning something new, even on the go.